Hi everyone. Today we are going to present our project called Ukraine Conflict Intelligence. We used two datasets in this project. The first one is ACLED, which is our main dataset. It contains more than 96,000 conflict event records and includes information such as event dates, locations, fatalities, and civilian-related incidents. The second dataset is UCDP. We mainly use it as an independent source to check whether it shows similar conflict patterns. In our analysis, ACLED is used for the main findings, while UCDP is used to support and validate our results. Based on this dataset, we wanted to answer three questions. First, how did the intensity of the conflict change over time? And second, where were the highest risk area in Ukraine? And finally, what were the humanitarian impacts of the conflict, especially on civilians? These three questions guided all of our dashboard design and analysis. Before looking at the results, I will briefly explain how we prepared the data. Before starting our analysis, we divided the conflict into two phases. Events before 2022 are classified as pre-invasion, and events after that are classified as full-scale invasion. We also created two important indicators. The first one is lethality index, which simply tells us how many fatalities happened on average in each conflict event. The second one is civilian targeted percentage, which tells us what proportion of conflict events involved civilians. And finally, we grouped the data by month, region, and location so that we could study the conflict from different perspectives. And now let's move to our first research question. We first looked at the overall scale of the conflict between January 2018 and March 2023. More than 96,000 conflict events and over 42,000 reported facilities were recorded in Ukraine. However, what surprised us most is not just the total number of events. The severity of the conflict changed dramatically after the full-scale invasion. The share of civilian targeted events increased from only 1.3% before the invasion to 7.9% afterward. At the same time, the average fatalities per event increased by more than 30 times. This number suggested that the conflict became much more severe after February 2022. To understand to understand when this escalation happened, we looked at monthly conflict trends. One important thing to note is that the post-invasion period is much shorter than the pre-invasion period. Even so, it recorded more than 42,000 conflict events. On average, monthly conflict events increased from about 1,000 before the invasion to more than 3,500 afterward. In other words, conflict activity became about 3 times higher after the full-scale invasion. So this tells us that the increase was not just a short-term spike. Conflict activity remained consistently high after the invasion began.
And now that we have seen how the conflict changed over time, let's take a closer look at where the conflict was concentrated and how it affects civilians. We also found that conflict events and fatalities did not always increase together. For example, March 2022 marks the immediate escalation of the invasion. However, the highest number of fatalities they actually happened later in November 2022. This suggests that simply counting conflict events is not enough. Some conflict events are much more severe and deadly than others. Therefore, both number of events and their lethality are important when studying conflict intensity. Next, we wanted to know where the conflict risk was concentrated in this map. Darker colors represent a higher average number of fatalities per conflict event. Uh, Donetsk recorded the largest number of conflict events and fatalities overall. However, regions such as Luhansk and Kherson showed a higher lethality per event. This means that the areas with most conflict events are not always the most dangerous in terms of fatality. Overall, conflict risk was mainly concentrated in eastern and southern Ukraine. Um, After looking at regional patterns, we zoomed into specific locations. We found that fatalities were concentrated in a relatively small number of frontline locations, uh, such as Luhansk, Bakhmut, and Kherson. They recorded particularly high fatality totals. This location level analysis is helpful because it can reveal conflict hotspots that may not be obvious when looking only at one region. Our third research question focuses on humanitarian impacts. One interesting finding is that nearly one in four conflict events in March 2022 involved civilian targeting. This was the highest level recorded during our study period. And another interesting point is that the peak of civilian events occurred in March 2022, while the peak of fatalities occurred in November 2022. This tells us that civilian exposure and the overall conflict lethality do not always follow the same pattern. Therefore, civilian targeting provides another important perspective when evaluating humanitarian impacts. To better see to better study the conflict, we also looked at historical data from UCDP. The timeline showed that the conflict did not begin in 2022. In fact, conflict-related fatalities had already been recorded since 2014, and 2014 was the deadliest year in the earlier Donbass conflict period. This provides important historical context for understanding the full-scale invasion. Uh, Finally, we compared ACLED and UCDP. Although two datasets report different fatality numbers, they both show the same pattern. The conflict, the conflict-related deaths, they existed long before 2022. Using two independent datasets gives us more confidence in our findings. Our goal here is not to find exactly the same numbers, but to see whether different datasets tell a consistent story. Um, to conclude, we found three major changes after the full scale mission. First, conflict activity became much more frequent and severe. Second, conflict risks were concentrated in specific regions and locations rather than being distributed in the whole country. Third, civilians became much more exposed to conflict events. By combining temporary trends, geographic analysis, and humanitarian indicators, our dashboard provides a more complete picture of how the conflict evolved over time. Thank you.